Hi, everyone. My name is Rigo Valdez. I am president of the United Latinos of the UFCW. Hola, mi nombre es Rigo Valdez y soy presidente de los Latinos Unidos de la UFCW. Si usted quiere escuchar este taller en español, por favor, oprima español en el menú de opciones que aparece abajo de la pantalla junto al icono del micrófono, video y chat. Ahora tenemos a Alejandra Marroquín y Alexia Beitia en la línea de español apoyándonos el día de hoy con la interpretación. Voy a pasarle la palabra a Ale.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alejandra Marroquín, and today with me is Alexia, my compañera Alexia, and here we are fomenting the idea of language justice. And right now, what we're doing is consecutive interpretation, but we will be jumping into simultaneous interpretation soon. So the idea of language justice is that everyone has the right to be understood, to speak, and to share in the language that they feel most comfortable in. Also, language justice is the shared responsibility that everyone has a responsibility to create a bilingual space. So if at any moment you see me doing this gesture, it's for the panelists to slow down because we may not be able to keep up with you. Also, if at any time you see me doing this gesture, it's for you to speak up. Maybe you're having a technological issue or we need you to get closer to the microphone. Also, please be on the lookout for any alerts, or if you have any issues with technology, let one of the people know that's a panelist or potentially Clara. Also, when you hear us interpreting in Spanish, you will note that we are using the E form rather than the A or the O. That's intentional, it's not a mistake. It's our effort to break through gender binaries. Thank you. And with that, Alexia, please in Spanish.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Alejandra Marroquín y aquí conmigo está mi compañera Alexia Beitia. Hoy estamos fomentando el valor de la justicia del lenguaje en esta llamada. Ahorita estamos haciendo interpretación consecutiva, pero en un momento vamos a pasar a simultáneo usando la herramienta de Zoom. La justicia del lenguaje es el derecho que todos tenemos de comunicarnos, entender y ser entendidas en el idioma en el que nos sentimos más cómodos. Es una responsabilidad colectiva también para todas las personas del espacio, por lo cual les pedimos que si nos llegan a ver haciendo esto, significa que la persona que está hablando, para los panelistas, tiene que hablar un poco más lento para poder seguirles el paso. También, si nos ven haciendo esto, significa que la persona tiene que hablar un poco más fuerte o pegarse su micrófono si hay algún tipo de problemas con la tecnología. También para las personas que nos estén escuchando a través de la función, no sufran en silencio, hagan a alguna persona saber, ya sea Clara o a las personas que están a cargo del cuarto. También en español, si nos escuchan hablar con la terminación E en lugar de U, de O, perdón, o de la A, no es un error de pronunciación, pero es algo súper consciente para romper con el binario de género. Y eso es todo por ahora. Le pasamos la palabra de vuelta a Rigo. Gracias.
Gracias a ustedes. Bueno, pues nos vamos a despedir de ustedes. Vamos a empezar la interpretación. Muy bien, intérpretes, ¿nos pueden oír? Okay. Very good. Thank you all for that. Again, you know, we want to make sure that we have everyone participating at every level. So I just want to thank you all for joining us on our second webinar of our ongoing series, Latino Voices. I'm proud to announce that we're running this webinar in collaboration with the School of Workers at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and we'll be excited to hear from the Dr. Ibarra, an assistant professor and director of their Chicano Latino Studies program. Thank you to the School of Workers for co-sponsoring this event. For those of you joining us for the first time, the United Latinos of the UFCW is a constituency group within the UFCW, and it was created to claim spaces in our movement and in our union by developing Latino leadership and increasing Latinx visibility and representation. We hope to better serve our rank and file membership. As labor, we are in a history-making moment, and we know that the work ahead will be challenging, but together within our union, We are on track to make tangible changes in our organization. We join in the celebration of our new Civil Rights Director, Laquita Honeysucker, who we know will lead us with determination and make our union a better place for all of our members. Felicidades, Director Honeysucker. I'd also like to send a personal and organizational congratulations to newly elected president of Local 367 in Washington State, a longtime United Latinos member, Angel Gonzalez. Felicidades, hermano. But most of all, I'd like to thank my new partner in crime. I'd like to thank and congratulate the newly elected Secretary Treasurer of the United Latinos, Secretary Treasurer Martin Rosas. He joins the union as a rank and file member 17 years ago and is now president of Local 2. Martin has served on the board of the United Latinos, and his fierce leadership has pushed us to do better for our members, especially in the efforts of the New American Citizenship Program. Martin challenges us to do better and to be better as an organization and as a union. So I'd like to turn it over to Martin. I'd like to turn it over to Martin now.
Gracias, Rigo. Gracias, and thank you. Let me point a clarification. I was hired at the age of 17 years of age at Cargill in that city, Kansas, since 1989, but I hope it was 17 years ago, but it hasn't. It's been way longer than that, but thank you, brother. First and foremost, I want to thank the Executive Board of the United Latinos for their support. I want to thank Rigo Valdez, a brother of mine, and really someone that I admire his job and everything the United Latinos represents at the moment. It's an organization that wants to move forward and really bring some meaning to the movement, to the UFCW. This is a constituency group to serve the purpose of the organization, UFCW. I hope and I can serve all the members of this organization. Hope that we can serve with dignity and respect to the all the members of the UFCW. I'm looking forward to work for you and for everyone in this conference. And I want to thank you, Rigo, because these webinars, well, many other groups remain irrelevant during this crisis. Rigo Valdez, the president of United Latinos, has been very creative in trying to create this movement and enhance our level of communication with the members of the UFCW. So, gracias, muchas gracias a todos. Espero servir con dignidad, respeto y con mucha intención de crecer esta organización para seguir sirviendo a nuestros hermanos de la UFCW a nivel nacional e internacional. Gracias. Thank you.
Gracias, Martin. We look forward to your new role in leadership in this organization. You've led us through quite a bit, and I admire you a lot and the work that you do at your local for our folks. Lastly, I want to encourage folks, anybody who's here, to do a roll call. So there is a chat down at the bottom. There's a chat. Our guests are from outside of our organization, so they don't know who you are. So if you could, in the chat, put your local number and the city that you're representing, or the state that you're representing, or the area you're representing, that would be helpful to our panelists to know the breadth of the 3 countries that we represent. You know, the United Latinos is a 3-country organization: Canada, Puerto Rico, and Estados Unidos. And so we want to encourage everyone to let yourselves be known. So, I mean, without further ado, you don't want to hear any more from me. I want to introduce another kick-ass organizer, leader in her own right. I met Rina about 20 years ago when we were working in San Francisco. Rina Wong is a member of the United Latinos Executive Board and has been newly elected to our executive committee. She comes from Local 663 in Minnesota. Rina Wong, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Hola a todos. So happy to be here with you today. I am from Minnesota, and we are so happy that you've come to join our discussion. So welcome, bienvenidos a todos a nuestra charla. Today, we want to be able to talk with you about the state of Latinos in Canada, in Puerto Rico, and in the United States. And we have an amazing panel for you that today is going to discuss about the growing Latino power, economically, socially, politically, all of this really juxtaposed against what we all hear and know in our hearts, right? That Latinos have the highest COVID infection rates, that there are these immigration debates and the rise of dangerous right-wing rhetoric that dehumanizes our community. But there's no doubt in the midst of all of that, that Latinos are the future. United Food and Commercial Workers, we represent workers in retail, meat packing, manufacturing, healthcare, and other industries, all with growing numbers of Latino workers. And so it is more important than ever to understand Latino communities and the issues that impact us in order to organize and grow power for Latino workers, porque el futuro es Latino. The future is Latino. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce you first to Carlos Jimenez. He leads the projects for the AFL-CIO's organizing department. And in that role, he supports and plays an advisory role to unions and organizations undertaking strategies and campaigns to build density and power. He was previously the executive director of the Metropolitan Washington Council, AFL-CIO, where he also served as a member of the AFL-CIO State and Central Labor Body Advisory Committee and as vice president for the Maryland, DC AFL-CIO. Carlos came to the AFL-CIO after more than a decade of union, political, community, and student organizing, including as the regional organizer at Jaws with Justice. So, bienvenido, Carlos.
Hey, thank you for having me. Can folks hear me? Awesome. Well, I guess I'd like to start off first and foremost by just expressing my appreciation to the organizers and everybody who's had a hand in making this event, for extending the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Thank you. For those at home,
Carlos, your mic is a little bit off.
Awesome. Is this a little bit better?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. I know that folks at home, there's lots of demands on your time for being in this new world of COVID, and so just really want to appreciate all you all making the time to get on. I think just building on what Rigo said, and I think maybe most importantly, just really want to express an appreciation for the existence of this space, because there's actually not that many spaces like this. And for all the work that you do inside your unions, through this caucus, and out in the broader labor and Latino community to help organize, to leverage, to challenge, to build, to hold power, right? And to use that power to make the world a better place for our members and the people we love. So just really, I've been getting in a continuously better mood as I've gotten to reflect and think about like a question this big, right? The state of Latinos or the Latinx community. Because actually, it's not a simple answer if you're talking about something incredibly diverse as the Latinx community, right? And so,
Carlos, can you just move your mic a little bit closer?
I sure can. Is this better?
Yes, a little bit better.
Okay. Now, I was going to do a screen share. Let me see if I can share my screen here with you all, because I do have some slides. It is possible to share my slide with you all. So I'm going to hold my mic here. So bear with me also. I was just saying that our community is, the Latino community, the Latinx community is incredibly diverse. And that became painfully obvious to me. And I almost started laughing when I started doing some look at the stats. I'm not going to get into these stats specifically, but it shows in the United States just a sampling of the diversity of like the population of the Latinx community, of how old we are, and the levels at which we're getting college degrees, right? So I share this slide really to make the point that I'm going to do my best to speak to trends, but also just recognizing that there's a ton of complexity and diversity in the Latinx community. And also my experience is largely US born and raised, right? So I'll have to apologize kind of ahead of time for any gaps in my analysis. Thankfully, there's an incredible panel here who, will fix any I'm kidding, but just to get into it, and in the interest of time, I kind of wanted to start not too far. I had the pleasure and the opportunity of being with some of you back in Vegas at the education conference in 2017. And we were having a different but similar discussion on Latinos and unions in the United States. And I remember back then striking this cautiously optimistic tone. For lack of, after all, we already had elected Donald Trump, or maybe I should say Donald Trump had been elected. And yes, we knew, I think we all knew how bad it was going to be, right? I remember just kind of mourning, my fears and what was going to happen to Latinx people in this country, and getting called hyperbolic or, called an alarmist. Like, it's not going to be that bad. But, to be brown or black in America is to live that much closer to the edge, to the economic cliff, and to being, to falling off the economic cliff. And so we've always known. But I gotta say, in spite of how disastrous this administration has been for the Latinx community, and really for all Americans, except maybe the super rich and politically connected, I won't say this out loud too much, I'm still somewhat optimistic, because even Donald Trump and all the hate mongers that he's amassed in his administration is not big enough and is not powerful enough to stop all of the progress of countless generations of Latinos and Latina folks that have come before us, who have worked their way to get us as far as we have, right? They are not big enough to stop that. And I do take some solace. And so when we were at the education conference, I remember actually talking about—
Excuse me, Carlos?
Yes.
Your mic keeps cutting in and out.
I apologize. I have a headset on here. I am trying to see if it's maybe a little bit better now. I'll slow down, Arena. Is this a little bit better?
It is a little bit. Sometimes it's really great and sometimes it isn't, just like all technology.
Yes, exactly. So I'm gonna slow down, try to control my voice and keep us going here in the interest of time. But just by reminder, and then I'll keep going here. When we were in Vegas a few years ago, we were talking about our population growth, about housing attainment, about educational attainment, and how it was all going up. And actually, prior to the pandemic and COVID really kicking off, actually a lot of these trends still held. In terms of growth, the Latinx community is still growing. We may no longer be the fastest growing community in this country, but certainly for 2020 purposes and this year's election, we are the largest quote unquote minority community that will have 32 million votes cast at the polls, or could have up to 32 million polls, right? In terms of housing, and again, this is one of those that with COVID I'm worried about, but the Urban Report was saying last year that by 2030, or in 10 years, Latinx folks would account for more than 56% of all new home sales were going to go to Latinx folks, right? So just think about that. Like, in a few years. And the trends in education continued, right? The last 20 years have seen a big decrease in high school dropout rates and an increase in high school graduation rate, and about an 80% increase, frankly, in cumulative enrollment in education if you go from like kind of preschool through post-secondary education. We went from 9.9 about 18 million folks in education. So quite an attainment, right? But I want to be careful with these statistics, because if you only go by those statistics, you might end up saying something like the CEO of Goya did last week. And I'm not going to get into the CEO of Goya and what he said last week, but he used many of the same statistics I just referenced to try to make the case that actually Latinos should be thankful to this administration for all they've done, and that the president deserves the credit for the progress of the Latinx community. It is actually important to look at a few other statistics, looking at Latinx workers from an organizing perspective, because some of those actually do give me room for concern, right? And so just a couple of minutes and then I'll be done here. I would say that it's useful to start taking a closer look at some of the demographics and what the trends tell us, right? And so we can just start by looking at where Latino folks are living, right? Latinx folks are living, right? And so nobody's probably surprised of the big three, but actually I wonder how many folks knew that the greatest growth of Latinx folks is happening in the South, right? Not in California, it's Texas, it's North and South Carolina, it's Georgia, right? And I'll come back to this, right? But there was a little bit of other data that I think, just gave me pause for concern. And so now I wanted to show the 2019 Bureau of Labor Statistics number. And just, the small, but I think meaningful decrease in total unionization, but also the small decrease in Latinx workers in unions, which I actually think are interesting because they show that there's actually more, literally, percentage of the economy, right? So more Latinx workers got jobs and came into the economy that were organized, but we actually had more, and I thought that was an interesting statistic. But going back to where the growth is happening, some of these numbers also gave me pause for concern, right? And so I highlighted some of the unionization rates in the states where you're seeing some of the fastest growing numbers of Latinx. Why? Because I want people to think about, like, what do you think is happening with the labor relationship between employers and workers in these states? And do you think employers are kind of inviting Latinx workers to come into these states to like, have, just share in the riches, or, just be fair-minded? I don't know. I don't know that the data bears that out, right? And we'll get into that, right? And frankly, if you looked at the zone of where the growth was happening, it's a lot of where that red is. And as a trade unionist, that worries me, I will say, right? And I think, just not to paint a bleak picture, because I'm going to come back around and turn it around, but I mean, Bloomberg, the newspaper, had a really incredible long-form article last week that I just think was really interesting, right? I mean, it goes without saying that Latinx workers are everywhere, but I think we don't want to deny that there is a particular concentration of us in construction, in agriculture, in hospitality, in service, in retail, increasingly in education and healthcare. And we see here in this slide on the left that these are some of the fastest growing sectors of the economy, right? That's good. Unfortunately, we also have a really unequal economy, which the slide next to it shows, that basically suggests that people have been working a lot harder for a lot less money than they were 30 and 40 years ago, right? And so this is the economy in which growth is happening, right? And not to, kind of even be more of a downer, but this is also what Latinx workers are coming up against, right? This is a little bit of a look at the increased spending by companies in union avoidance, right? And so it just kind of shows the trend, and it's not restricted to one sector of the economy, right? And that, friends, is why I'm worried, because I don't think it's a done deal. I don't subscribe to the idea necessarily that demographics are a predictor of destiny. By that I mean that just because we have more Latinx folks, it doesn't automatically mean to me that we're going to have economic improvements of our life. I think that takes organization, and that takes power. And so I shared all of this not to be a downer. I think, on the contrary, I think the data tells me there's a giant need, maybe even an opportunity to roll up our sleeves and figure out some of these organizing questions. And where am I, if not in a room full of people who are serious about power and are serious about organizing? And I remember, I mean, this was maybe 15 years ago, right? Longer, 20 years ago, when they said it was impossible in North Carolina, when folks thought that Smithfield was too big and that workforce was too challenging. But I also know that it was folks in this room, and there was this great union, and it's not just there in North Carolina, that across the country, this union has a history of proving those naysayers wrong. And I know part of why we can come together is because of spaces like these, where we can come, we can train, we can develop our skills, so we can go and organize. And so I think it's, I think it's maybe not the worst outlook, the state of Latinos, but I do think to build and cement the gains we've been making historically, we need to continue to organize and have organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos, for sharing that information with us about the trends and for the Latino community. Next up, we have Monica Guisar. Monica is Associate General Counsel with the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, where she serves as counsel to the International Union's Immigrant Justice Campaign. She has dedicated the entirety of her legal career, over 20 years, to representing workers, unions, and immigrants. And prior to joining SEIU, Monica was an attorney and shareholder with the union side law firm of Weinberg, Roger, and Rosenfeld. Her practice areas with the firm included traditional labor, employment, and immigration law in both the private and public sector. So bienvenidos, Monica.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. I am so appreciative and thankful to the United Latinos to invite me to join you on this webinar series. So today I'm going to talk about the state of Latinos in terms of what's happening both at the federal level with respect to various policies that have been enacted by this administration, as well as recent court decisions that impact immigrants and also in large part Latinos, because of the fact that a great number of immigrants who are currently in this country are Latino, and those who are attempting to come into the United States are Latino. So next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the impact of the current pandemic on Latinos, and Carlos just mentioned this briefly. I just wanted to give a few statistics in terms of what that impact is, and also talk about the policies that have impacted Latinos notwithstanding this pandemic. Next slide, please. So first, as Carlos mentioned, infections among Latinos have far outpaced the rest of the nation. Just in the last 2 weeks, counties across the country where at least a quarter of the population is Latino have increased in infections 32% compared to 15% with the rest of the counties. In California, for example, where Latinos make up 39% of the population, there's been 57% new cases. In North Carolina, Latinos make up 10% of the population, and they've have 46% of infections. In Wisconsin, Latinos are 7% of the population and 33% of the cases. In Yakima County, Washington, the site of the state's worst outbreak, half of the residents there are Latino and were impacted. In Arizona, Santa Cruz County, they're seeing the highest rates of infections, where the Latino population is 84%. And so as we're looking at the pandemic, and we know that the way the administration has handled the outbreak, the pandemic, has been less than acceptable. And so when we talk about the pandemic and essential workers, we also know that a large number of Latinos are essential workers. So Latinos work in many industries that are where we have frontline workers, like leisure, hospitality, service industries, and healthcare workers. And as we know, and as the UFCW and United Latinos are extremely familiar with, meatpacking. More than 10,000 meatpacking workers, many of whom are Latino, have contracted the coronavirus, as reported by the UFCW. And 44% of meatpackers are Latino. And so clearly, Latinos are being impacted as we see that. And so there have been issues in terms of what has been the response to that, and how have immigrants and other people of color fared in all of this. And we can start with just looking at the relief packages that were passed by Congress. And if we look at the relief package that was meant to provide economic assistance to businesses and workers and families, we know that immigrants were largely left out of those packages. And many of the immigrants in this country are Latino. A survey of 1,800 Latinos across all 50 states stated that 48% of those households were making under $25,000 a year, and they did not receive any support in terms of the federal packages. So as we know, the CARES Act provided relief in terms of a cash rebate. And so if you did not have a social security number, or if you jointly filed taxes with a spouse who did not have a social security number, you would not be eligible, and you are not eligible currently under the CARES Act for that cash relief. Another example of where Latinos were left out of these packages include the 3 new unemployment compensation packages that were created. The first was a pandemic unemployment assistance, which would basically extend the amount of time that people would be able to receive unemployment. And this program specifically was meant to capture workers who are misclassified as independent contractors because employers put them and pay them off the books as independent contractors and don't classify them as employees. So if someone is unauthorized and isn't able to show to the unemployment agency that they are a person with lawful status and eligible to work, they would be ineligible for this assistance. And the same goes for the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, which expanded unemployment for 13 weeks, and the pandemic unemployment compensation, which provided folks an additional $600 a week of unemployment insurance. And so this is just an example of how even in the midst of the current pandemic, and setting aside the fact that we know that many employers are not providing appropriate personal protective equipment for frontline and essential workers, that workers are, as we've already indicated, contracting the virus, getting sick, and unfortunately many are losing their lives to the pandemic, yet this administration and the federal government really has done very little to assist workers, particularly Latinos and immigrants. Next slide, please. So next I wanted to talk about DACA and the TPS terminations and the impact of those programs and the administration's attempt to terminate those programs on immigrants and particularly Latinos. So as we know, we did receive a victory from the Supreme Court in the DACA decision, finding that the Trump administration did not properly terminate DACA. The court did not find that Trump could not terminate DACA. He could if he wants to. He just has to do it the correct way and provide appropriate reasons. But we know that more than 9 in 10 current DACA recipients were born in Latin America. For example, from Mexico, it's the top country for active DACA recipients. There's 548,000 folks who are in DACA status from Mexico, followed by El Salvador. We have 25,900. Next, Guatemala, there's over 17,000. Honduras, over 16,000. From Peru, 7,420. From Brazil, 5,780. From Ecuador, a little more than 5,000. From Colombia, about 5,000. And from Argentina, a little over 3,000. So you can see that that program and the fact that the Supreme Court upheld the ability for folks to remain in that status is helping hundreds of thousands of Latinos be able to continue to live in this country, work in this country, and not be separated from their families. We know that many DACA recipients, approximately 270,000, have approximately 270,000 US citizen children. And so I think, obviously, we applaud the Supreme Court's decision. It is a temporary victory for now. As we know, the Trump administration and Trump tweeted that he plans on rescinding DACA, although earlier this week he was interviewed in a news segment and talked about potentially providing legalization to DACA recipients. But for now, at least the program remains in place, and we will wait to see what happens. And the next update I wanted to talk about is TPS terminations. As we know, In 2017, the Trump administration tried to terminate DACA, the TPS program for various individuals. And I wanted to highlight there were many countries that the Trump administration wanted to terminate TPS, temporary protected status. And these are folks who have been in this country, some for decades, and were provided TPS status because of civil unrest or natural disasters in their home country. And I just wanted to give you the numbers. You see them on the slide of the number of folks who are impacted if in fact TPS is terminated. And this is, again, is hundreds of thousands of Latinos who have been living and working in this country. Next slide. And finally, I want to talk about some immigration, COVID-related administrative changes that impact immigrants, not only folks who are trying to enter the country and seek asylum, but also trying to limit many changes to legal immigration. Next slide, please. So some of the things that the government has done, basically using the pandemic as an excuse to try to stop legal immigration, to stop providing services, one of which is closing the USCIS offices. They recently reopened and they've recently started naturalization ceremonies, but from March through very recently, that office was closed. They were not processing new applications. If folks had submitted work authorization documents later on during the pandemic, they agreed to start processing. But the fact that, for example, no naturalization ceremonies were being held, that was impacting hundreds and thousands, again, thousands of folks who are eligible for naturalization, who had already had their naturalization approved, but did not have the ceremony. USCIS recently started drive-through ceremonies, so about 60,000 people now have been able to do their oath and get their citizenship, and now those people will be eligible and able to vote. But because of the pandemic, this is one example that we saw that limited the ability for folks who are already here lawfully to be able to continue to benefit from their ability to naturalize. And there have been many other changes by the administration that we've seen, like border closures, many changes to asylum. Just most recently, the federal government introduced a rule that would basically dismantle the existing asylum system. And if you really look, it would make it nearly impossible for individuals from Central America and Mexico to be able to obtain asylum in this country by removing the ability to request claims for gender-based violence, domestic violence, gang violence, etc. So there are lots of things happening at the federal level, lots of changes that impact immigrants, and particularly Latinos. And that's one reason why hopefully we will organize and get out the vote and change things around in November. But that's the update that I have in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica, for that update about the impact of the current pandemic on Latinos, and as well as the updates on the immigration decisions that are taking place right now. So next we have Pablo Vivanco. He is a Chilean-Canadian journalist and community organizer who is currently the Community Development and Program Director of the Jane Finch Center in Toronto, Canada. After serving as the director of Telesur English, he has been writing for publications including The Jacobin, Asia Times, RT, and The Progressive Magazine, among others, and has also been producing and editing videos for Press Progress, Redfish, Real News Network, as well as for unions in Canada. So welcome, Pablo.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Great. I'll try to make my intervention brief so that we have some time to interact. Entonces, buenas tardes, buenas noches, depending where you're at. As I said already, I'm in Toronto right now, so it's a little bit later than some of you folks that are in other parts of the States. I'm just going to share my screen here to go through the slide presentation. Okay, well, already went through a little bit of who I am. I've been working in the community sector as well as in communications for a long period of time, and collaborating with UFCW actually since the time I was in Toronto City Hall, working there in the middle of the last decade. So this early 2000s, early middle 2000s. But I've also been working in Latin American media as well as Canadian now, also obviously multimedia, online media, which is where a lot of things are. But if we're going to talk about the state of Latinos, Latinas, I wanted to acknowledge some things about you know, the discussions around who exactly we are and some of those discussions that are taking place around how we define ourselves, how we represent ourselves, because those things are part of the debate when we talk about, you know, and when we see how we're represented in media. I want to go through who we are, how we're seen, how we're portrayed, and also how we see ourselves, and then talk a little bit about how we can see, how we can be seen or how we should be seen and what we can do around that. But in terms of who we are, there's lots of things to acknowledge, a lot of things about our roots, our heritage, and how those things are reflected in names. And I know that your union is going to be talking about those, some of the things that have already been acknowledged around Latinx, the gendered, how we inherited in terms of gendered language, which is Spanish, but also some of the other identities that are part of who we are as Latin American descendants, our indigenous African heritage, a number of other things, as well as now all types of other discussions that are taking place, not only in our community, but elsewhere around gender identity. Obviously, we also have different nationalities that have already been talked about as well, which are very close to how people define themselves and also how people organize. And then one of the things which is perhaps often not necessarily talked about, which is in discussions around identity and how we define ourselves, but is obviously very important to you as a union, is our identity and our, you know, who we are as working class people, you know, and Latin Americans being 26 million workers, so roughly 50% of the entire Latinx, Latina, Latino population, however you want to define it, much higher than, you know, a lot of other communities once you start kind of breaking down ethno-racially there. And obviously we're talking about a huge number of people in Canada, States, and Puerto Rico, 53 million Latin American descendants, and a total population of 650, over 650 million when we take into account Latin America, so around 700 million people with some shared sort of identity and experience that we're talking about when we're looking at Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, all those different identities. In terms of how we're seen, the first thing that you know, when we're talking about, when we're looking at English media, because there's kind of some differences here and some similarities, but in terms of English language or North American media, we're underrepresented. Out of a recent study, as you can see from that, which was last week, that article there that I posted, out of 11,000 speaking characters surveyed in film and TV, 5.8% were Latin American descendants. So that gives you some indication of you know, how we're being put out there and how we're being perceived. But this also has, you know, some other reverberations. So all those identities that we talked about before, all those representations of our diversity are made invisible as a result, in part, of our lack of visibility in the media. We're homogenized, we're represented as, you know, the various aspects of who we are as a whole. The tens of millions of Afro-Latino people, for example, are made invisible. And, you know, you can see this is just a screenshot of an interview with a very popular morning show out in New York called The Breakfast Club that had an Afro-Latina artist, YouTube singer, come on, and, you know, they like, and this is supposed to be one of those woke breakfast shows or morning shows, and, you know, they were surprised. They'd never even heard of Afro-Latinos, right? And that gives you some indication of, you know, how we're being represented out there. The other part of it, the part that perhaps is more familiar to people, is the exoticization, how Latin American women are exoticized, the overwhelming times that Latin American women are represented in media, they're represented in some sort of sexual manner. And also in large part, there's a criminalization of our community in media. And this has real world consequences, right? Like, I mean, this isn't just, you know, something about people not liking us or representing us poorly. You see this when, you know, there's Latin American descendant kids that are in cages, or that 23% of Latin American descendants, that there's 23% of the total US population, prison population, are Latin American descendants. These are the consequences when we have a president of one of the most powerful states in the world characterizing our people as rapists, killers who come from shithole countries. I apologize for putting those words out there. Those words aren't mine, but it gives you some indication in terms of, you know, what we're dealing with when we talk about the state of our people in our diversity and all of that within a media that we, up until this point, haven't necessarily controlled. But we've inherited this, and we can't necessarily just say that this is something that's taking place in English media. Media in Latin America has been for decades overwhelmingly the same, or shared a lot of these characteristics. Ahistorical and racist representations and stereotypes, the same things that now are being kind of complained about over here in terms of, you know, actors playing parts outside of their race. Those things have been common features in Latin American media for a while. And we still see those things today. If you see a telenovela, obviously you're not necessarily going to see a representation of what most people in our countries look like. So as a result, you know, we see ourselves we see ourselves as we, but as we are told we are, not necessarily as we are. So I had a little bit of a video that I wanted to quickly show that kind of gives some indication. This was a Chilean journalist who was speaking to Chilean television from New York during some of the demonstrations. Not sure if you're able to hear. This is during the recent demonstrations over police violence. And, well, you may not actually be able to hear. Let's see.
No, unfortunately, no sound, Pablo.
Okay. Well, so just to break it brief, so he's speaking to to Chilean television, a Chilean journalist who was in New York during these demonstrations, saying, quite frankly, the people with lighter skin, the people with skin like me are afraid, right? So this gives you some indication, and obviously the social networks in Chile put this guy on blast, right? Because, you know, looking at him, this is somebody wanting to think of himself as almost not actually being Latino, right? Trying to say, well, you know, white people like me are afraid on the streets right now. But this is a consequence of, you know, how media has represented us and how we've seen ourselves through that lens. So now, how can we be seen? Some of you maybe seen this movie, Roma, won a lot of awards and won a lot of accolades because of the fact that, you know, the actress, a Mexican actress of indigenous origin, aside from the fantastic role that she played, like, I mean, she played a working class Mexican woman, and they didn't go out and get someone that, you know, didn't look like that, right? So there was a lot of discussion that this generated, and it's good to fight for, to ask for better representation in the mainstream in order to show, you know, that diversity, to show that those identities that we talked about before, and show them truthfully, right? But also, and perhaps more importantly for the purposes of this discussion, and what I wanted to kind of focus on, is the fact that the media landscape has shifted a lot, and it will continue to shift. This is the average time spent with major media per day in the United States as of a couple months ago. And you see in terms of minutes where digital is in relation to TV or, for example, newspapers. Same thing in Canada.
Lo mismo en Canadá.
Also, like, yeah, you can see the comparison between television and internet. And similarly, in Puerto Rico, the market share of people in terms of how they consume the information that they use in order to understand their world, and also right now in order to engage in their world and the things that are going on, is shifting. And it's shifting away from mainstream media, which has been controlled by large conglomerates, to a space which obviously has a lot of problems. And we can, we're not going to go into that right now, but it has a lot of problems because it also elevates voices, dangerous voices, but it also can elevate our own voices. So we don't have to rely on Hollywood or companies. And, we've seen from a long history that, they aren't our allies. They aren't, we shouldn't expect them to all of a sudden represent, who we are, let alone the type of things that we would like to see represented about who we are and the world we want. There are open spaces, that are being created out there, social networks and the internet, where we can make meaningful interventions. Organizations, particularly, specifically, can make meaningful interventions, and that are quite inexpensive, actually. So, where I would kind of end this off is, just thinking about how organizations like unions can encourage and train individuals, your members, but also, your members are part of their own networks. They have friends and family. In terms of social media training, how to engage, how to be active on social media, and how unions can engage their members and have that multiplier effect across your organizations. But also, how you can organize the collective around objectives and campaigns. Already, elections have been talked about a number of different times, and this isn't something new. The use of social media and its impact on elections and things is something that's been acknowledged and put out there, for years now. I don't think that progressive organizations have necessarily been, at the center of that discussion, but I definitely think they should be. And education and dialogue to build a common understanding of issues in order to be able to influence the public debates on those matters, not just elections, but strikes, all types of social issues that emerge. And, also the last bit here, there is actually a history of unions running media, controlling their own media. I'm sure lots of you, I know UFCW, you'll have, your Facebook pages, your newsletters, but, there was also a time where, unions and labor federations, and you also see this in other parts of the world where, you actually have newspapers that have mass distribution, or radio. Obviously, in other parts of the world, radio is still a big thing. But like I said, right now, thinking about how to make, meaningful and large mass interventions using internet and using online media is something that I think is actually within the grasp of organizations, particularly unions. So with that, I think that, that's how we can be seen, and we should be talking about how we should be seen. So let's organize ourselves to be seen.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for sharing with us your thoughts around how Latinos identify and are identified in the media, and sharing your thoughts about how we can start changing that narrative. And so next up, we have Dr. Armando Ibarra. He's an associate professor in the School for Workers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He serves as director of the Chicano and Latino Studies program, as a faculty Latino specialist for cooperative extension, as a research affiliate in the Applied Population Laboratory, and as affiliate faculty in the Labor Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research and fields of specialization are Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano and Latino working communities, social movements, community development, international labor migration, and community-based participatory applied research. His publications include award-winning books, journal articles, policy and applied research reports, and documentaries. So welcome, Armando. Armando, you're on mute. If you wouldn't mind just going back on your slide.
That's fine. It happens to me on a daily basis. Well, thank you, United Latinos and the UFCW for this invitation on this very important panel. And thank you to the other panelists also for teaching me. I'm very humbled to be here. And I'm also very tired. You know, we've been in social distancing and isolation since March, and it's important to acknowledge that these are difficult times. Even bigger than that are the difficult times that we've had as trade unionists, as members of immigrant communities, as members of different communities that are being attacked by this current administration. Pero como dicen, how they say, the best organizer is always the boss. And so we have left 111 days, 5 hours, and 12 seconds until the next election. And that's the time that we have here going forward. So I created a narrative more so than a PowerPoint presentation, because I want to show my positionality, how I engage in popular education and action research in general. And so I will give you my narrative and then afterwards take questions. But know that at heart, I am a trade unionist, and at heart, I believe in the working class struggle. And at heart, I know that there's better days to come for our movement. I am a scholar activist and a trade unionist. I am a member of the American Federation of Teachers United Faculty and Staff Local 223 at UW-Madison, where I exchange my intellectual labor for wages and work alongside labor unions, advocacy, and service organizations. In Wisconsin, we have no labor rights as faculty members and public workers. So we don't necessarily act, we act as a union because we have interest as workers with our employer. There's more than 100 of us that have come together and voluntarily pay our dues to our organization so that we can carry out our message as working people here at UW-Madison. My research and publications are on topics of struggle. Specifically, I focus on working class social justice movements and the roles of Latin American immigrants and Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, and Latina, Latino, Latinx populations. Get used to it. Most recently, I published a book called The Latino Question. The purpose of this book was to interrogate US Latino populations' identities from a working class perspective. This book has done surprisingly well and won the 2019 Best Book in Latino Politics Award from the American Political Science Association. I was very surprised when I got the email that we won this award, given that we give a class analysis and the critique of political economy from this organization. I share about this work because I believe that there is a hunger for popular education and working class studies from students in traditional academic institutions, from many of our union sisters and brothers, and working people in general. How can we continue to engage in working class struggle and advance a collective worker agenda if we as a movement do not have a baseline understanding of who we are, how we got here, and what democracy and struggle mean for us as trade unionists? We simply cannot. My home department is called the School for Workers. It has been around since the 1930s and has provided labor education to trade unionists and action-oriented research to labor and social justice movement organization. Our primary role as academics is to keep at the center of our mission and service trade union and workers' agendas. There are business schools in almost every college in the country. Every college in the country has a business school. There's only a handful of labor education programs in these same colleges, and there's only one school for workers. And oftentimes you have to ask yourself, why is that? I think I have my opinion, but that would be for another panel. Our tagline is education for workplace democracy. As you all know, this simply means that workers have a voice in workplace rules, redistribution of profit, wages and benefits, and some production decisions. It is an inclusive vision of democracy rooted in the idea that workers deserve to participate in all aspects of the means of production. So what is action research? I brought that up briefly because action research to me is more of a tool than anything else. Well, simply put, action research is research with a purpose. Research that is not necessarily destined to be published in traditional academic presses, but instead it is used in campaigns, or to document and bring to light cases of exploitation and worker struggle. In the tradition of Ernesto Galarza, which in my opinion is one of the most influential social thinkers and labor and civil rights activists in the 20th century, when you give an organizing issue public life with meticulous research, it can no longer be ignored by the public at large or the powers to be. To my sisters and brothers who are joining us today, learn about Ernesto Galarza. He is one of the very first national trade unionist scholar activists in the country, first PhD Mexican immigrant who organized cross-ethnic, cross-racial and across the country and in Latin America as well. So if you don't know who he is, I wrote a book with a collection of his work that I don't see the picture of up there, but that's okay. Just Google him. Our book is called Man of Fire, Selected Writings of Ernesto Galarza. Over the years, I have conducted or been a part of action research and projects which some of you might have participated in as well. I will share just a few and note that these were with Latina, Latino, and Latinx Spanish-speaking immigrant and non-immigrant communities, both union and non-union. In the summer of 2003, I worked for the Pruitt Organizing Fund as a researcher. I was part of a team that conducted a heat assessment of poultry and hog plants in the South. I worked mostly in West Virginia. Like today, then, most of the workers in the plants I visited were Latino immigrants. For example, in Moorfield, West Virginia, a large number of workers were newly arrived Hondureños, Mexicanos, and Puerto Ricanos. Most new arrivals at this plant were scared and had little connection to the US labor movement. Organizing workers with these demographics and in these types of anti-union hostile worksite is nothing new for labor. Rather, this has been the norm context for generations. So we know it's hard to organize. And we know there's a lot of folks out there that are scared to come together and demand for their rights. It's nothing new. It's just gotten increasingly more hostile with this administration. A few years ago, a team from the School for Workers investigated donning and doffing violation allegations at the National Beef Plant in Liberal, Kansas. I saw some folks here from Liberal, Kansas. Saludos desde Wisconsin. The workers at this plant are members of the UFCW Local 2. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to engage with plant workers, but we were told that the workforce was diverse with many ethnic and racial groups, languages, and immigrants and non-immigrants. I later learned that a friend's family's member from Califas had migrated to Liberal to work in the plant. We are always looking for that next best chances as workers here in this country. We conducted a Spanish language training for a UFCW local in Milwaukee on the profit sharing plan. Many members participated in this training and learned the basic functions of what profit sharing is. So we had a day-long training with about 15 members who participated in this profit sharing plan. And we walked them through the math and we walked them through the plan itself. It was an intense day, but it was highly necessary that we had. We also provide production standards and time studies classes that many UFCW members have attended here in Madison or at their local offices in the different areas of the country. In the community, I am active with Voces de la Frontera. Voces is a grassroots immigrant, worker, and youth-led organization whose mission is to protect and advance civil and workers' rights, especially as they impact the most marginalized communities. The core of Voces' strength is the broad community trust it had earned and the thousands of members through decades that have organized and engaged in direct action. Nationally, the state of Latina, Latino, and Latinx workers. Nationally, Latinos have reached close to 60 million, thus constituting over 18% of the total population and becoming the second largest demographic group in the country. We are undergoing a demographic shift that is reshaping our national ethnic profile. The impact, however, is not only demographic. Substantial changes are also taking place in our cultural, social, labor, political, and economic spaces in key areas of the country. Our Latina, Latino, and Latinx labor communities are central and vital to the US economic order. This is nothing new for our working class community, but for many of the most marginalized Latina, Latino, and Latinx workers whom industries have habitually used as cheap, deportable, and replaceable workforce, they are now being categorized as essential and expandable as well. It's quite ironic. Overall, national union density stands at a bit over 10%. For Latinos, the national overall union rate is between 9 and 10% as well. Simply, 90 out of 100 workers in the US, Latino and non-Latino alike, more than likely do not understand what it means to be union or have had limited exposure to the labor movement and its impact on society. To correct this unfamiliarity, labor needs to be taught in a substantial manner in K-12 in our communities and within our unions as well. In my humble estimation, the role of independent popular education, action research, and scholar activists are as needed today as in any other time in recent history. We cannot create a collective consciousness without understanding that our identities are shaped, interconnected, and bound by class struggle. I am often asked, what creates solidarity? And my response is quite simple: acts of solidarity. Black Lives Matter and systemic racism. Immigrants' rights are worker rights. No human is illegal. Love is love. Science is real. Without labor, nothing prospers. And kindness is everything. Gracias.
Gracias, profesor. Thank you for sharing your findings and your studies with us tonight in our conversation. We have some folks who have some questions for our panelists here, who are getting queued up to do the live ask.
Here, let's see, Monica Vargas Huertas, I'm going to bring you up as a panelist so that you can ask your question. Are you ready? And then turn on your video, Monica, so we can see you. And let us know where you're joining us from. Monica? All right. Well, while Monica gets ready to ask her question, if you want to ask a question, we can bring you on as a panelist, but you need to ask your question in the question and answer part, and then we'll know to bring you on. So, Monica Vargas Huertas, going once, going twice. Maybe we'll just read your question. Go ahead, Rina.
Sure. So Monica is asking, what do you consider needs to be done in order to merge the immigration reform movement with the grassroots Black Lives Matter movement? For our panelists, anyone, please go ahead.
Well, this is I guess, big questions day. That is a big one, an important one. And I guess I'll just start off by saying I don't know that I'm going to fully answer that, so apologies if I disappoint. That I guess just two observations in the question. I mean, I think I appreciate the orientation towards finding intersection or this term of linking up arms with other folks that are organizing, and I think that's a very good instinct. And I think the orientation, and the question also leads me to think that you're somebody that's thinking about building power and what it's going to take to kind of align or weave together, you know, the new future coalition, you know, in this country. But you know, this is a really tough one, and I actually appreciate the specificity of your question. And so I don't know, but I think I can think of some things to do that maybe are helpful. Maybe they're not, but you know, so let me, I guess, say that. I mean, I think when I think of your question, you know, and this has been on my mind the last few years, but I do think that there's a body of work to be done, frankly, on our side and within the Latinx community around like deconstructing or even naming and dealing with anti-Blackness, which is a thing that has been going on for a very long time. I mean, you don't get Black Lives Matter unless there is a belief and an idea in society that Black lives don't matter. And so I just think we need to name that, right? And I think it starts very young, to be honest with you, in the Latinx community. We may not even know it, right? The nicknames we give to our friends because of like the lighter skin or the darker skin, right? Like the things we say, that starts young. And so I do think there's that work internally in our community to do. And you started even seeing some of that, right? I'm kind of reminded of there's this organization trying to build political, you know, whatever. There's trying to build political power that was out critiquing Univision and Telemundo for how they were covering, you know, a lot of the Black Lives Matter manifestations. So for what it's worth, one, but two, I think the actual answer is interesting. So I think one of the things we need to be figuring out is just, and maybe people are doing this, so I apologize if this is so remedial. But in my organizing training, I'm often taught that this question of solidarity and alignment is really hard to sustain, and that to really kind of do, I think, what you're trying to get at or asking about, you have to be in relationship as organizers, as people, as organizations, right? So there's just that question of like, are we in spaces, and what types of spaces are we creating to intentionally create this alignment? There's just a question, right? Because I think in those spaces, and you're able to do some of the wrestling to identify values, to identify actually different interests. There are different experiences and problems that our communities are dealing with that are related, and I think need to be discussed, and then allow you the opportunity to have a conversation around power, around strategy, around like what we're going to do to move our shared interests together. But so I think one of the things I would figure out is like, well, what are we looking at opportunities to bring more people to be in relationship, right? Like, are we ourselves trying to figure out how to be in relationship with more of these movements and with more of what's coming up? And how are we finding ways to make those links? So it's not an answer. It's maybe just more questions, but I really appreciated the question, so I'll stop there.
Would any of the other panelists like to add anything?
Sure, I will add just a little bit of what I'm thinking with regards to this question. Really important question, very timely. I'm not sure that they're not linked, right? I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive. I think struggle is something that over time, you know, it overlaps. To end systemic racism in the United States via the Black Lives movements, to defund police or the police state via the Black Lives movement is directly linked with some of the agenda goals that the immigrant rights movements have. So moving that agenda and aligning them, I think, is important to understand. Also, I think that it's important to look at the humanity behind Black Lives Matter. You know, it's a move for full inclusion into our social structures and in full respect of humanity at the very end. And it's a humanity, you know, that has been ranked in our country here in the US based on, you know, how well you do with material conditions. Material conditions shape our reality, how we eat, how we survive, how we either pass on generational wealth or not, are all, you know, interrelated within the idea of Black Lives Matter. Liberation of if liberation comes from the Black Lives Matters movement, it's liberation for many in the many immigrants that are impacted by the current laws that we have as well in my installation.
I just want to add just a quick thing. in addition to what Carlos and Armando said, I think within our own community, we need to promote that issue as our issue. We need to stop thinking about it as like that this is an issue for Black people who are external, right? As if they were external, right? Like as if there aren't tens of millions of Afro-Latinos, right? Like, you know, it's again part of, you know, our own reconciling that we need to do in our families and stuff. I think Carlos spoke to it well, right? That, you know, we see these things happen. We don't have to look academically at it. Like, you know, we've all had these family experiences or whatnot, you know, the uncomfortable things said by somebody at the dinner table or whatever, right? It not only just, I guess, challenging those, but trying to get folks to understand the reality that has been, you know, denied from back in our countries, from back when our parents grew up, and that continues on to this day, that I think, you know, still reflects in that idea that somehow this is something external, right? Where it isn't, right? This is actually Black people are part of our community, and we're part of their community, and, you know, and then on top of that, like, I mean, we share spaces, we share experiences of oppression as well, right? So I think we need to see ourselves reflected in the things that Black folk are going through.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your responses in this moment, right? It is so very important that we acknowledge that it's a shared struggle, that we are all really trying to fight for the same things here for the community, and that liberation for Latinos isn't going to happen without the liberation for Black folks as well. So we have another question here for all of the panelists. Please feel free to just jump in. But what do you all believe is the role of the UFCW United Latinos in terms of how do we use it as a platform to set the narrative around organizing the Latino workers and community in this moment, right? In this moment of COVID, in this moment of right-wing extremism, and in this moment where we really do have the opportunity to harness the power of Latinos to really show that we are the future.
This is Armando. I think the you know, UFCW as an international in the locals across the country have a lot of power. You know, they're here in Wisconsin. I know that the UFCW is the largest private union that represents the most workers here, in private sector workers. I think that you continue to be bold in your organizing. Continue to knock on doors, continue to be present in community coalitions that have similar goals. I know that you know, continue to educate members not just on union administration themes, but also on social movement and social justice, and to stand and be bold in your statements because people listen.
Again, I'm not part of UFCW, but, you know, working in my own fields, I've collaborated across folks for a number of years. And one excellent thing that UFCW here in Canada has, particularly in the province where I'm at, has been doing over the last little while is not only organizing, but getting some significant gains for migrant workers, you know, who are overwhelmingly from Central America and Mexico, as well as the Caribbean. But, you know, because labor laws are actually, you know, they're controlled by the province, the province here, which is like our state, like, you know, Ontario is like, you know, the state of New York or whatever. They control the labor laws, and they've denied pretty like some of the most basic rights for migrant workers for a while. And unfortunately, with the COVID crisis, there's been a few workers that have died, but the union has been, actively working and organizing around the rights of migrant workers. When obviously they don't have to, it's not like they're members, right? But they're doing that. They're doing that work anyway and trying to ensure that they are able to get rights, that they are now able to get the things that have been denied from them for decades. So, and they're on the verge, I think, of making some pretty significant gains for tens of thousands of migrant workers in this province. So I think that that's one example of some, important work that UFCW has been doing here.
That's great. Thank you all. It's the question that we always ask ourselves. So we really kind of thought that with you all joining us, we would love to get your input as we think about the role of our organization and the path that we want to take to make sure that we are organizing at every opportunity. So we really appreciate your time and your thoughts and your expertise. Rodrigo?
Yes. Can you hear me?
You're very low.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh.
Is this better? I encourage you all to read our Black Lives Matter statement. The United Latinos was one of the first to issue such a statement. Before a lot of labor organizations issued a statement. It calls on ourselves to look at our own anti-Blackness. It calls on ourselves to do better, to educate ourselves, to become allies, and to acknowledge who we are as a community. We are also a community of Afro-Latinos. I wanted to read you that statement, but unfortunately, due to technology, I was not able to pull it up. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their busy lives today to come and continue this series. In the last series, we heard from Latino leaders from across the country. Today, we heard about subject matter experts. And as we continue our popular education series, it is my pleasure to announce the next, if technology will allow me, the privilege of announcing the next, hold on one second, of announcing the next, yeah, it's not gonna let me do it. It's not gonna let me do it. Sorry, technology, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right, Carlos? I'm gonna just wing it. The third installment of our series, Latino Voices, will be August 4th, again at 7 p.m. Look at that. And it's going to be Cafecito with Esther. Esther Lopez is a retired secretary treasurer of UFCW, as well as former Secretary of Labor for the state of Illinois, as well as Civil Rights Director for our union. She's done so many wonderful things. She sat on this board as long as I can remember and helped shape what our organization looks like today. So if you enjoyed today's panel and you enjoyed today's discussion, you enjoyed today's narrative, please join us for our next installment, the third installment of the Latino Voices series, Cafecito con Esther Lopez, August 4th at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. In closing, thank you, Armando, Pablo, Carlos, Monica, for all of your time, for your wisdom, and for your for sharing. Just for sharing. We really appreciate all of that. I'd like to thank our interpreters, Alejandra and Alexia, who did a great job. I want to thank our moderator, Rena Wong, and our only staff person at the United Latinos, part-time staff person, also Yale PhD candidate, UFCW Local 770 alum, Clara Mejia, who makes a lot of this happen. Thank you so much for everything. As we log off, I want to thank the leadership of my local union. As you guys know, I proudly serve as the Director of Organizing and Vice President here of Local 770 in Los Angeles, California. I'd like to thank my president, John Grant, for being always supportive of Latino issues, of race and ethnicity and equality and justice and respect. He is a great leader and allows us the ability to do this. So thank you, John, and thank you, the members of Local 770, for your contribution to this webinar and to the United Latinos as a whole. With that, I want to log off and say thank you so much and end with this refrain. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. Por supuesto que sí. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Gracias. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.